Welcome everybody today. It's nice to see everybody here. And yeah, I just want to say thanks for being here for a little afternoon gathering at the Grolier. My name's Adam. I'm a friend of the store. And I just wanted to say we're so happy to have Adam Mahler and Richard Zenith here, and they're going to introduce one another. So you'll hear more from them. But thanks for being here.
Oh. We're going to introductions. So you're going to
Yeah.
When? After?
Let's do both the introductions and then you start the
Oh,
reading.
okay. Hi, thanks for coming. And on this lovely Friday afternoon, there might be other tempting things to do in good weather. So we're really happy to be here, and we won't go on with long introductions, but I'll just tell you that Adam Mahler here, I met him 10 years ago about, and he was, after his first year at Yale, he was already working on a translation of Camilo Pessoa. Camilo Pessoa was a symbolist poet, Portuguese poet, one of Fernando Pessoa's favorite poets. And when Pessoa and others who admired his poetry, it hadn't yet been published, just a few things here and there in magazines, but it would circulate by word of mouth. And Pessoa actually had poems memorized of Pessoa. Well, Adam was showing me his translation. Oh, I should say it's very difficult to translate. I never had the courage to do it, but Adam did have the courage. And then so we got to be friends, and then he ended up finally publishing a book of his translations of Pessoa. And Adam finished up at Yale, and then he went on to do a doctorate at Harvard, which is finishing up now. He's translated other authors. His area at Harvard is medieval Iberian poetry. And he's had grants from Penn Foundation, from Fulbright, and voila, now he's going to introduce me.
Hi, everyone. Richard Zenith is a tough act to follow and also a pretty hard one to introduce. So what I'll say is this. For the last 3 decades or so, he's been living in Lisbon, and those 30 years have yielded about 900 years of Portuguese literature and translation, ranging from the Galician Portuguese troubadours and their cantigas, to the love poetry and lyrical output of Camões, the great Renaissance poet, and of course, Fernando Pessoa. And that's to say nothing of your translations of Brazilian authors, contemporary Portuguese poets. Many of you may have read his biography, Pessoa, for which he was named a Pulitzer Prize finalist. He's also the winner of Portugal's Pessoa Prize, I think the only American to earn that distinction. And today he'll be reading from a few books, including Pessoa Co, which is a collection of Pessoa's poems, and then it's going to be released any day now, from what I hear, Sonnets and Other Poems, the poetry of Luís de Camões. So without further ado, I'm going to let Richard take the mic.
Well, about Fernando Pessoa, there would be an awful lot to say, but I'm not going to go there. It would just take too long. Well, I'll just say very little, just a very basic, is that he was born in 1888 and died in 1935, and is known, I think probably most of you here know, that he's wrote under many different names. And the most important of these names he called heteronyms. So they other names, but for Pessoa, they weren't just other names, they were other personalities. And the heteronyms had different styles, different interests, and just very, very different voices. So I hope maybe some of that can be conveyed by some of the poems I'm going to read. I'll be reading from this book, Fernando Pessoa and Company, which originally came out about, I can't remember, 25 years ago. And this is actually a revised edition, which just came out 2 years ago. If you have the old edition, it's worth paying $17 to get the new edition because it's greatly revised. There's also 20 new poems, and some of the new poems are kind of interesting. In fact, today I'm going to read at least half of what I read will be of these new poems. So the first in 1914, these heteronyms, the major heteronyms of Pessoa, there were three, emerged. And the first one was Alberto Caeiro. And Caeiro's most important book was The Keeper of Sheep, O Guardador de Rebanhos. And this is a poem from The Keeper of Sheep. What we see of things are the things. Why should we see one thing when another thing is there? Why would seeing and hearing be to delude ourselves when seeing and hearing are seeing and hearing? What matters is to know how to see without thinking, to know how to see when seeing and not think when seeing, nor see when thinking. But this, if only we didn't have a dressed up heart, this requires deep study, lessons in unlearning, and a retreat into the freedom of that convent where the stars, say poets, are the eternal nuns and the flowers, the contrite believers of just one day. But where, after all, the stars are just stars and the flowers just flowers, which is why we call them stars and flowers. So Alberto Caeiro was kind of like an antidote to Fernando Pessoa. Fernando Pessoa was very intellectual, extremely well-read. And in this poem, it talks about the need, lessons in unlearning. And so Caeiro, who suddenly exploded in the life of Fernando Pessoa and was a surprise to Fernando Pessoa, actually, and wanted to see things just as they are and without adding anything to them. So he's all about just taking reality with the senses. And so it was kind of completely contrary to Fernando Pessoa. And this is a new poem that I added also of Alberto Caeiro. As when a man opens his front door on a summer day and gazes full-faced at the heat of the fields, sometimes nature suddenly hits me smack in the face of my five senses, and I get confused, mixed up, trying to understand I don't know quite what or how. But who told me to try to understand? Who said there's something to be understood? When summer passes the soft, warm hand of its breeze across my face, I need only feel the pleasure of its being a breeze, or feel displeasure because it's hot. And however I may feel it, because that's how I feel it, is what it means to feel it. Well, shortly after Alberto Caeiro emerged, so I had the idea of making Caeiro a modernist poet with various facets. And so there was a project of him to write five odes, five futurist odes. And there were various attempts at these futurist odes. They didn't go very far because the idea was kind of have these long, sprawling odes. Celebrating urban life instead of, because Caeiro was a poet of nature, but then he was supposed to also have this urban side. So, but then after some kind of false attempts, then Pessoa wrote a very long ode to the end, which was the Triumphal Ode. But then he realized that this wasn't, it was no longer Caeiro, it was a new heteronym, and that was Álvaro de Campos. Campos means fields. So my theory is kind of for the name is that Álvaro came out of the fields of Pessoa. And I won't read that very first poem of Álvaro de Campos, but I'll read one that's kind of in that vein, the kind of futurist vein. And because Campos was about feeling everything in every way possible. This is a long poem. I'll just read a part of it. The best way to travel, after all, is to feel everything in every way, to feel everything excessively, because all things are, in truth, excessive, and all reality is an excess, a violence, an extraordinarily lucid hallucination, which we all live together in the rage of our souls. The attracting center of this strange centrifugal forces that are our human psyches with their senses all in concert. The more I feel, feeling as various people feeling, having numerous personalities and having them keenly and acutely, feeling with all of them at once, and the more I feel, live, act, and am unitedly diverse and scatteredly attentive, that much more will I possess the sum total of the universe. That much more complete will I be in all of space. That much more will I be analogous to God, whoever he is, since whoever he is, surely he's everything. And besides him, there's just him, and everything's a trifle to him. Every soul is a stairway to God. Every soul is a universe corridor to God. Every soul is a river flowing between shores of outerness toward God and in God with a melancholy murmur. And then it goes on for three more pages. So Campos is all about just feeling everything as intensely as possible. And he's constantly, whereas Caero accepts what is as it is, and that's enough. For Campos, nothing is enough. He's always frustrated. He always wants more and more. Now I haven't mentioned the third of the major headers. I will in a minute, but I want to now, we're going to switch back and forth, hand it over to Adam.
Camilo Pisania, a lot less well known, of course, than Fernando Pessoa. He's kind of at the same time Pessoa's predecessor and contemporary. He was born in 1867, 21 years before Pessoa. He was writing his first poems, I think, like early 1890s, so long before Pessoa. Actually, not that long before Pessoa had started writing. And he was born in Coimbra, which is a city sort of in the north central part of Portugal, famous for its university, and at that university, he had a short-lived career as a lawyer. And then in 1894, he moved to the Portuguese colony of Macau, which was part of Portugal until 1999. The handover in 1999. He spent the better part of his adult life in Macau. He sort of moved fairly frequently between mainland Portugal and Macau. He's been claimed as a Macanese poet or a poet of Macau, but actually probably a little over half of his poems were written during these periods of convalescence. He's frequently ill, and he would kind of retreat to the countryside in Portugal to get better. What to say about his poetry, particularly in relation to Pessoa? And today I'm going to try the poems I read to say a sentence or two to kind of bring them into a dialogue with Pessoa's project. Pessoa was a big fan. His favorite poem is a poem called Violoncelo, which I think we'll be able to get to today in the reading. And what did Pessoa admire about Pessoa, and what was Pessoa bringing to Portuguese literature? More than anything, an immense amount of sonic energy. He's a poet of one of these synesthetic poets, not quite punny, but sort of he's constantly there's a lot of pyrotechnics at the level of language. He was sort of a lot of neologism in his lines. He has this very erudite Latinate vocabulary. If we are going to put him in the context of sort of European poetry more generally, he's definitely a symbolist, sort of the Baudelaire variety. He loved French authors like Baudelaire and emulated in one way or another their models. I think for those who are familiar with Pessoa's output, it might be a little hard to see the link because Pessoa brings us literary modernity in Portuguese. It's kind of it feels a lot more contemporary than, say, someone like Baudelaire might. But I think more than anything, Pessoa yeah, he would have admired the immense verbal energy and again, all this kind of intense soundscapes. And then there was an early phase in Pessoa's life where he sort of self-identified, among other things, as an intersectionist, which was a poet who kind of triangulated the different senses to, evoke these really potent feelings in the reader or the listener. And I think on that score, Pessoa is definitely an intersectionist poet. And I'm going to start with a poem called Phonograph, which I think is a good sort of intersectionist poem, if we can call it that. And I'll read this one in both languages. Phonograph. Vai declamando cômico defunto, uma plateia ri perdidamente do bom jarreta, e há odor no ambiente a criteia pó do anacrónico assunto. Muda o registro, eis uma barcarola, lírios, águas do rio, a lua, ante o seu corpo sônio meio flutua sobre paúl, estática carola. Muda outra vez, gorjeios, estrabilhos de clarinho doiro, o cheiro de junquilhos, vido e agro, tocando a alvarada. Cessou, e amorosa alma das cornetas quebrou-se agora orvilhada e velada, primavera, manhã, que eflúvio de violetas. Phonograph. A dead comic performs his set. The audience roars with laughter at his stale act, which fills the air with an odor of dust and crypt. The record changes to a barcarolle. Lilies, the lilting river, the moon. Beneath her body floats my dream, a swoon of petals on a swamp. Again it changes, chirrups, bitter notes of jonquil, a golden bugle sounding in due time the reveille. Silence. The cornet's gentle music falters, massed and soaked with dew. Spring, daybreak, a rush of violets. So considering this is formatted as a sonnet, sort of the content of it is not what you would expect. And I think in that way too, Pisani is kind of, if not quite foreshadowing Pessoa, because again, they are contemporaries, you can sort of see a kindred spirit. Now I'm going to read a poem called Chinese Guitar. This is another one of these, it's incredibly difficult to translate because it's just really a lot of verbal pyrotechnics. It's also one of the few poems that makes an allusion, however minimal, to China, where he spent a lot of his adult life. And maybe I can say a thing or two about that after reading it. Chinese Guitar. To the sound of the slow guitar, the crowd's chatter drifts asleep, and I, in my languor, disregard every word tediously uttered. Nor does my heart falter, while the shrill, irksome chatter of the crowd drifts asleep to the sound of the slow guitar. And yet what tender scar does that guitar offend, making those tiny wings unfurl in a burst of pain, slowly, to the guitar. As you can see, as an allusion to his life in China, it's pretty meager. You don't get a lot of information. But what I can say is Pausanias, unusually for a man of his time, really did have chops in like sort of classical Chinese literature. He was not sort of one of these Edward Fitzgerald translators who, though the final product was very important in literature, was maybe not the most accurate depiction of the Persian source text, whereas Pisani really did have mastery over Chinese. And sort of the way I read this poem is the Chinese guitar is in some ways a figure for maybe even the Chinese language. It's sort of plucking at his heartstrings quite literally. Maybe one more and then I'll let Richard take the mic. So like Pessoa, who lived for a number of years in South Africa and as a result had to embark on these huge ocean voyages, Pausanias was a big seafarer out of necessity. And Portuguese literature in general has this intense maritime quality or focus, in part because sort of the earliest works in the tradition celebrate the overseas voyages of colonial expansion that sort of established the Portuguese Empire. So this is a reckoning, I think, with Pausanias' own journey, ocean journeys. It's kind of similar. I think actually this is when he was crossing the Suez. I forget what for. I don't think that would have been on the way to Macau. And of course, Pessoa has written Crossed the Suez and wrote a poem inspired by that crossing. This poem is untitled. Slivers of sea coast, gulls circling the ship take my muddled brain, glimmering emerald channel, sun-flooded deserts, my poor brain addled and infirm. Traced inside it is a web entangled in fitful torments, water filtering through the sand. Before dusk arrives, dusk in the tomb-dwelling larvae dissolve the useless impurities. Unblemished sun, placid crystal, gently heat the cold and bloodless pulp to a vaporous essence. A breath, pale and uncertain, it will not fog with its venom the glimmering azure transparency. Glimmering outlines of shore, take my body and open my veins, pour out my blood as an offering, spread it over the red glowing sun, over the white sand as over a bed sheet, the triumphant sun under which I swoon. So if you compare this to one of Pessoa's great poems of overseas voyaging, it's quite morbid, it's quite abstract. You can sort of see that Baudelairian influence. But for someone acquainted with the Portuguese tradition, this is quite a remarkable literary treatment of life at sea. So with that, I'm going to let Richard take back the mic.
Yeah. So before I go on to that third major heteronym of Fernando Pessoa, I'll talk a little bit more about Campos and read one more poem of Álvaro de Campos. So Campos was the most over the top, as you could glean from that poem that I've read already. And as at the beginning, he was this kind of quasi-futurist, just shouting, celebrating the machine age and travel and so forth. And then as time went on, he became more melancholy. And I think the Álvaro de Campos is really the closest heteronym to Fernando Pessoa himself. Outwardly, he seems quite different because Pessoa, although he spent 10 years of his childhood in South Africa, and so he was perfectly fluent in English and wrote a lot of poetry in English and prose. Once he got back to Portugal when he was 17, he never again left the country and rarely set foot out of Lisbon even. So he traveled in his imagination, but not with his feet. And Álvaro de Campos, on the contrary, because he's heteronyms, so invented biographies. And so according to Pessoa, Álvaro de Campos was born 2 years later than Pessoa, studied mechanical engineer in Glasgow, traveled around the world, then came back and worked as a naval engineer in North England, and then Newcastle, but then eventually came back to Lisbon. He traveled far and wide. He was also bisexual, had relationships with men and with women, whereas Fernando Pessoa almost certainly died a virgin. We know that from his notes, actually. And so while they were outwardly quite different, I think that Álvaro de Campos was like Pessoa's id, that instinctive part, according to Freud. So Pessoa was shy, and Álvaro de Campos, he managed to realize and imaginatively many things he maybe would have liked to do, but was too shy to do or to say. Álvaro de Campos was also an important mouthpiece of Fernando Pessoa. There were articles that were signed by Álvaro de Campos, and sometimes disagreed with Fernando Pessoa. So he was quite a character. But you see, this poem I'm going to read now, it's not so well known, and it's new to this volume. But it clearly is Pessoa, really, who's talking here through Álvaro de Campos. Pessoa published relatively little in his lifetime, but his ambition was to be was literary immortality. And so the title of this poem is On the Last Page of a New Anthology. So many good poets, so many good poems. They're also equally truly good that not one stands out in memory. Or they're remembered by chance in the lottery of posterity, their rank depending on the impresario's fancy. So many good poets. Why do I bother to write verses? When I write them, they seem to me like what my emotion used for writing them seems to me, the only great thing in the world. The universe shivers in awe of me. Once they're written, visible, readable. And what about this anthology of minor poets? So many good poets. What's genius, after all? And how do we distinguish genius or good poets from good poets? Maybe they're not distinguishable. Better just to sleep. I close the anthology, more tired of it than of the world. Am I no different? So many good poets. God Almighty. And then right after Campos emerges, which was in around May, June of 1914, a couple of months after Alberto Cairo, then yet a third bundle of energy emerged in Pessoa, a poetic energy, and that was a classicist poet writing odes in the style of Horace. And I said that the heteronyms had different style. Cairo and Campos actually both had a free verse style, although Campos did write some sonnets and rhyming poems. Ricardo Reis, like the Greeks, kept a strict meter, but did not rhyme. And one of the first poems, or odes, his odes were short in the style of Horace. And one of the first ones was the following. The gods grant nothing more than life. So let us reject whatever lifts us to unbreathable heights, eternal but flowerless. Let our only science be to accept, and as long as blood still throbs in our temples and love does not shrivel, let us endure like panes of glass, transparent to light, pattered by the sad rain trickling down, warmed only by the sun and reflecting a little. So there's that Horatian no acceptance of things as they are, and kind of a sort of a kind of a sad acceptance. Life is could be more, but this is what the gods have given us. Álvaro de Campos, these heteronyms, well, Álvaro de Campos and Ricardo Reis both saw Alberto Cairo as their master. And Fernando Pessoa himself, who wrote an awful lot of poetry under his own name, also said that Alberto Cairo was his master. But Ricardo Reis and Álvaro de Campos, they argued a lot among themselves in prose texts. And they both recognized a master, but they were very critical of each other and about their literary styles and so forth. And then Ricardo Reis, in some of his odes, he sings to maidens, Lydia, Chloe, Naira, who are maidens that come from Horace. Horace has these very same maidens that he addresses some of his odes to. So they reappear in Ricardo Reis. Álvaro de Campos, who I said was bisexual, he wrote in a prose text, he kind of outed Ricardo Reis, and he claimed that that these maidens were actually, that was sort of a stand-in for a young boy that he was actually singing to. Well, there's a poem now I'll read of Ricardo Reis, which seems to suggest that there might have been some truth to that. I was never one who in love or in friendship preferred one sex over the other. Beauty attracts me in equal measure, wherever beauty is found. The bird alights, caring only about alighting, its desire to alight mattering more than the branch. The river runs where it finds its slope, and not where it is needed. Thus I separate myself from distinctions. I love wherever love happens to me, without offending the inherent innocence of being in love. Love is not in the object, but the manner. I only love something when I start loving it. My love does not reside in it, but in my love. The gods who gave us this path of love that we call beauty did not place it only in women or only in fruit. they also gave us the flower to pluck, and perhaps we pluck with better love what we seek for the using. It's a very curious poem, this, but those lines, my love does not reside in the object, but in my love. So whereas two people might think that, you know, that they become one when they're passionately in love, Pessoa would never agree with that idea. There might be something new between those two, but each one has their own love, and which is, according to Pessoa through Ricardo Reis, has to do with the manner, with the desire. It's an interesting poem, and so also according to this poem, the sexual object is then indifferent. Then, as I said, Pessoa wrote a lot of poetry under his own name, and I'll read now maybe his, what you could consider his signature poem. This poem has been translated. I think there are at least 40 published translations in English. Here's mine. Autopsychography. The poet is a feigner who's so good at his act, he even feigns the pain of pain he feels in fact. And those who read his words will feel in his writing neither of the pains he has, but just the one they're missing. And so around its track, this thing called the heart winds, a little clockwork train to entertain our minds. So according to Pessoa, you can never communicate fully what you feel to anyone. You can you can utter words, write a poem that might stimulate in that other person something similar to what you feel. And so that's so you have the poet has his pain, and then but when he writes, that's even you can't even understand your own feeling in a sense. So your poem, your even that your real pain is feigned, which isn't to say it's a lie or falsified, but it's just this problem of being able to express. It's a construction. So that's in that sense, it's feigned, it's forged. You know, forged is an interesting word because it can mean to falsify, but also simply to make. And that's the idea in Pessoa. But then the reader will feel neither of those two pains of the poet, that is the real one and the one embodied in a poem, but then his or her own feeling that's stimulated by all of that. And I'll read this one in Portuguese. So, autopsicografia. O poeta é um fingidor, finge tão completamente que chega a fingir que a dor que deveras sente. E os que leem o que escreve, na dor lida sentem bem, não as duas que ele teve, mas só a que elas não têm. E assim nas calhas de roda, gira a entreter a razão, esse comboio de corda que se chama coração. And let's go back to Adam. Okay.
You are.
Okay.
So I'm going to read a poem now in both languages. That is, it makes me think a little bit of Alberto Cairo, if only because it sort of inverts his poetic preoccupations. If Alberto Cairo is confident in his poetic vision and its clarity, and that what we see is what really is, Son is very nervous, he's very anxious, kind of really preoccupied with the acuity of his vision. And of all, you know, because these are kind of somber poems, moody poems, kind of hard to, sometimes it's hard to know what to make of them. Given that this is one of the poems that at least moved me very much when I first encountered Pessanha, there's something in its sonic weave that is very evocative. Imagens que passais pela rétina dos meus olhos, porque não vos fixais? Passais como a água cristalina por uma fonte para nunca mais? Por um lago escuro, onde termina vosso curso, silente, de juncais, e o vago medo angustioso domina. Por que ires sem mim? Não me levais? Sem vós, o que são os meus olhos abertos? O espelho inútil, meus olhos pagãos, ardeste de sucessivos desertos. Fique sequer, sombra das minhas mãos, flexão casual de meus dedos incertos, estranha sombra em movimentos vãos. Images that pass across the retinas of my eyes, why don't you remain? You pass like crystalline water through a fountain of no return, or into the murky lake where your course ends in the hushed stillness of reeds and vague anguished fear reigns. Why are you leaving and not taking me? What are my open eyes without you? These pagan eyes, useless mirrors, dull dryness of desert upon desert. Stay, shadow of my hands, you at least. Random flexing of uncertain fingers, strange shadow that moves in vain. Now I'm going to read, this is really one I should read in both languages. Yeah, why don't I? This is Pessoa's apparently one of his favorite poems, I think, in Portuguese, and certainly his favorite poem by Pessanha. It's untitled in this edition, but it's also in some versions called Cello. Chorai arcadas de violoncelo, convulsionadas, pontes aladas de pesadelo, de que esvoaçam brancos os arcos. Por baixo passam, se despedaçam no rio os barcos. Punhas soluçam calais de choro, que ruínas ouçam, se debruçam que sorvadouro. Trêmulos astros, seidões lacustres, lemas e mastros, e os alabastros dos balaustros. Ordens quebradas, blocos de gelo, chorai arcadas, despedaçadas de violoncelo. And even if you have no Portuguese, I think you can just hear sort of how these various lines are fitting together and sort of how active it is at the level of sound. And it comes in a tradition of symbolist poetry where sort of the expressiveness of a violin or an instrument gives rise to this really intense kind of nightmarish landscape. And I think Pessanha's is kind of a distinctly Portuguese twist on that genre because it actually is about a shipwreck. And again, Portuguese literature has a lot of that. It sort of is constantly reckoning with its maritime past, present, and future. Weep, O wildly arching bows, sweeping the cello, winged bridges of nightmares. The broad white arches swiftly flutter, passing beneath them, boats on the river break into pieces. They keen and wail in streams of tears, what ruin, listen! Swooping deep, what churning sorrow, flickering stars, forlorn lakes, rudders and masts, and the balustrades made of alabaster. Shattered urns, thick flows of ice, weep, O tattered bows, and sweeps across the cello. I think Richard, when he comes up next, close us out, is going to read from his new translation of Camões. And I think to kind of prepare us, I think a good way to pave the way is to read maybe one sonnet of it's a sonnet and sort of a love poem after a fashion by Pessanha. I think it's a really pretty one. Page here. Sorry, let's finish. Ok. Floriram por engano as rosas bravas no inverno, veio o vento desfolhá-las. Em que cismas, meu bem? Por que não calas as vozes com que há pouco me enganavas? Castelos doidos, tão cedo caístes? Onde vamos, olhei o pensamento de mãos dadas. Teus olhos, que um momento perscrutaram os meus, como eram tristes. E sobre nós cai nupcial a neve, surda em triunfo a pétalas de leves nucando o chão, na crópula de gelos. Em redor do teu vulto é como um veio, quem acha esparso quanta flor, seu sobre nós dois, sobre os nossos cabelos. They were fooled into bloom, the wild roses. Winter's wind stripped them of their petals. Why so distracted, my love? Why cut off your voices that so lately fooled me? Castles in the air so swiftly raised. Where are we going? Our minds wandering, hands locked. Your eyes, which briefly studied mine, how they look sad. The snow showers us, a wedding feast, silent and triumphant, petals coating the ground in the acropolis of ice. It swaddles your face like a veil. Who on high is sprinkling all these flowers on her hair, on the two of us? So you can see he has even a hard time writing a sort of unambiguously amorous love poem. And sort of that opening figure of the leaves falling off a tree with the first wind in winter, and sort of, the parallel, why the voices of the lover falling off. I think that's a sort of a good introduction for Camões, and maybe some more poetry from Pessoa, if you're interested.
All right. So, yes, Portugal's other very great poet is Luís de Camões, who was born in 500 years ago in 1524 and died in 1580. And there's debate about among the Portuguese and other people, well, is Camões greater or Pessoa greater? But yeah, I think they're the two greatest. I would agree with that, but I don't get into the debate. They're both very great poets from different times. And this is actually a new edition with revisions. I translated some years ago a selection of Camões's sonnets and other lyric poems. And whereas in the poem that Adam just read, talks about love, talks about leaves falling, and for Camões, love is a fire, love is passion, and that's the main subject of his lyric poetry. So here's a sonnet. Love is a fire that burns unseen, a wound that aches yet isn't felt, and all was contentment, pain that rages without hurting, a longing for nothing but to long, loneliness in the midst of people, never feeling pleased when pleased, a passion that gains when lost in thought. It's freely wanting to be enslaved. It's counting your defeat a victory. It's showing loyalty to your killer. But if it's so self-contradictory, how can love, when love chooses, bring human hearts into sympathy? I'll read one more. I have to say that this sonnet, there's a lot of debate about certain poems, if they were actually by Camões or not. And because Camões, he published this great epic poem, the Lusíadas, the Lusíads, 8 years before his death. But his lyric poetry was, except maybe for one poem, never published in his lifetime. And then it circulated in songbooks, and then there were editions that came out posthumously. But there a lot of good poems were said to be by Camões that maybe were not. So, and this is a poem we can't be sure that was really by Camões, but it doesn't matter. I think it's a very great sonnet from the time of Camões. Whoever, lady, sees plain and clear the lovely essence of your fair eyes, and doesn't from seeing them go blind, hasn't paid your looks their due. This seemed to me an honest price, but wanting to earn those eyes twofold, I also, for their sake, gave life and soul, remaining with nothing for myself. Thus my life and soul and hope, and everything I have is yours, and the profit from this is mine alone, since it gives me so much bliss to give you everything I can. The more I pay you, the more I owe. I think that last line is just, a killer line. And the whole, and the sonnet, with all this vocabulary about finances and profit and owing and so forth. And so he puts love in that that template of financial vocabulary. And so it's just an honor to owe this woman he loves so greatly. So how are we doing on time? Should we?
Ask questions?
Yeah, should we open it up for questions for about anything? And why don't you just stand up here with me? We can, depending on who the questions are for.
So, in just the last, so many thoughts, but that's great. Thank you so much, both. Wonderful. So, it's just this wonderful biography of John Donne by Catherine Rundell, just out, brilliantly done, about this erotic poet. And there's so much
Oh.
yes, just great. Well, I haven't. So, unrequitedness seems in commotion, and isn't there a lot of this on this wonderful unrequited pain in all of this?
Well, yeah, yes, in Camões there was. However, Camões he had both. He had in real life there he had we know from letters of his he had a lot of sex and requited love, who knows? In his poetry, there's a lot of unrequitedness. But Camões was a very passionate person, very much of the world. And as a young man was kind of rowdy, traveled all over. And so he's quite opposite from Pessoa. And I didn't mention that Pessoa early on, before he even published hardly any poetry, wrote a prose text claiming that in Portugal about Portuguese poetry, claiming that a new Camões, a super Camões, was about to emerge. He was talking about himself. So Pessoa prophesied his own greatness, and that he was that was his ambition, was to surpass Camões. Some people think he did. But he was very different because Camões was so gutsy and outwardly passionate and expressive, and Pessoa, he had it all within. And as I said, he apparently died as a virgin, and so there's in Pessoa, it's not even unrequitedness, it's untriedness. He didn't put himself out there, which isn't to say, and that sex and sexuality wasn't important for Pessoa. And when I wrote the biography that I wrote about him, I was surprised even by how much I already knew that that was important in Pessoa, but it's really even more than I thought. So he lived it in a different way, kind of his own. It wasn't exactly asexuality; it was a inwardly lived kind of sexuality, which is quite interesting.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add is unrequited love looms large in a lot of the mythology around Pessoa, Portugal criticism. Sort of a lot of some scholars cite the reason for his big move abroad being the failure of his courtship of Ana Zorita Castro. And kind of in a weird, it just occurred to me there's a bit of a parallel with Pessoa, because you talk a lot about sort of the sexuality of Pessoa being realized virtually on the page. And Ana Zorita Castro, though they did not get together, Pessoa and she remained lifelong friends. And it was really at her initiative that his only book of poetry, Klapserdach, was published in 1920. So a union deferred and consummated, I guess, through publication.
Okay. Spencer?
Yeah, I've been thinking lately on and off about translation as one of the great places where rhyme lives on well into the 20th century for people who care about it. And I was curious how both of you as translators go about keeping the ear for it, keeping the habit for doing it in a living way, not a jangling way. And what place that has and keeping the instrument in tune as a translator for each of you.
Good question. You wanna?
Yeah, just
Sure.
quickly. Pessoa is poet of musique avant toutes les choses, or whatever the Verlainian mantra was. It's so essential, and it is really hard to translate. In my case, I don't, do rhyme in any sort of systematic way, and year rhyme or a perfect rhyme here or there when they come naturally.
On the year when you read.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly poems where he's, such a maximalist that I kind of no holds bar, all the alliteration. And I also just think for me, one of the great joys when it comes to retaining form, a poet's the most salient characteristics of their form is actually translating a whole book, because it's sort of this, you translate across the project, and what you lose in one poem, maybe recover in another. So for me, it's a kind of diagonal or transversal translation that helps it work. I think both me and Richard are more insistent on keeping a fairly regular meter and rhyme when translating these difficult poets, but I don't know, you can probably explain a lot better.
Can add something. Yes, yeah. Well, I think that with music, I think for both of us feel that rhythm is really, kind of key, even more than rhyme. And actually, last night, a couple of you here who were at a different event about Camões, and there I said, and I'll repeat it here, that I did set out to make rhymed sonnets. So it was about more than a dozen, 15 sonnets that I worked on very hard, and rhyming them, of course, using near rhyme, because full rhyme would be virtually impossible without really screwing up the rhythm and using a much expanded vocabulary rather than rather limited lexicon of Camões and so forth. I didn't want to do that, so I was using these near rhymes and some perfect rhymes, and worked and worked and worked. But then friends, translators, and poets said, not yet. And I went back to the drawing board and tried some more. And finally, I decided I was sacrificing too many other things. But that experience was good, I think, because it helped me to understand how a sonnet works and to kind of this kind of machine of words that are all interlocking concepts and things repeating, but with a difference and variation and so on. And so it was a useful exercise, and I hope my translations sound like sonnets, even though there was not perfect lines. But I think also for both of us, I mean, it's obvious in your translations that sound is key, and your that dictates a lot of your choices, and it's all about making music, right? And I'd say in Basanya even more than in Pessoa.
Yeah, I mean, I think Basanya, part of the why it's maybe a harder sell is because he's not a really highly conceptual poet. It's really about the senses, and it's definitely hard to achieve in translation. But I also sort of I kind of stick up for Pisani as a poet of the image as well. Sort of there is, content there. And I think as a translator, I kind of believe in this quiet music of sort of the elegantly, in some ways, minimally rendered English poem.
Any other questions? Yes.
Do you have for you, Richard, do you take a particularly different approach in terms of translating each heteronym, or do you have a uniform approach overall and then take each poem by poem?
Yes, that's a good question. Well, I guess in its approaching each heteronym, I approach as if it were a different poet. So and then try to, if possible, embody and kind of like Brazilian umbanda or macumba, where spirits descending, and so you try to do something like that and just identify very closely with which you can do with Pessoa's main heteronyms, because I didn't go into great detail. But as I mentioned, he does have biographies for each one. They have different ideas about religion and about politics and so forth. And so, so that's how I do it. Yeah. Anything else? Robert.
Don't want to thing, but he wrote plays, right? He wrote plays, didn't he?
Pessoa,
Yes.
yes, he did.
So what's interesting to me is that he makes these characters, these heretics. And he didn't write that many plays, and is there a distinction between the way he approaches a heteronym and his characters that he plays?
Well, Pessoa, yeah, defined his whole enterprise as with the heteronyms as a drama in persons instead of in acts. And so the heteronyms were like different acts of his big play. And he insisted that he was a dramatic poet, not in the sense of writing poetry in verse, but in this whole with the heteronyms being like Hamlets. And then he wrote it on a piece of paper. At one point, he wrote that Oliver de Campos was a Hamlet with no play to act in. He was kind of, and so Pessoa was kind of like the stage on which his heteronyms then acted and spoke and kept speaking on that stage that was Pessoa's life.
I'm just wondering because I don't know with this biographical information that describes Pessoa's heteronyms. I guess first, where does that information lie? Like, is it within because I understand it's not necessarily easy to understand, say, Álvaro de Campos's biography from the poems he writes as a persona. So I guess on one hand, where does that information sit? And also, do you take Pessoa at his word when he's describing his own heteronym?
Good questions. Well, there is biographical information in the poems about the different heteronyms. However, it's true that Pessoa then changed the information. So, for instance, initially the three main heteronyms were, according to Pessoa, were all born in Lisbon. But then after a few years, he decided, no, that only Alberto Caeiro was born in Lisbon, but then lived out in the country in a white house on top of a hill, while Álvaro de Campos was born in Tavira in the Algarve in southern Portugal, and where a lot of Pessoa's family was on his father's side. And Ricardo Reis was born in Porto, northern Portugal. So you can see Pessoa, he's always wanting to be everything, everywhere, all at once. So he, chooses northern, central, and southern Portugal. And he then made Pessoa was a very proficient astrologer, and he drew up horoscopes, astrological charts for his heteronyms. And so a lot of the detail was much later, and in letters to and so forth, or in his notes. But so actually, the biographies, aren't really that important. But what does happen when this poetry first emerges, each one has an utterly distinct voice, and that it's not anything that develops; it just emerges right at the get-go. And so when Pessoa writes in a letter, which he evidently intended for posterity in the last year of his life, it's a long letter about the heteronyms, and he says that Alberto Caeiro that one day suddenly appeared to him, and that he wrote more than 30 poems in one go, sitting at a tall desk or draftsman. Well, we know from the manuscripts that it's not exact. He said it happened on the 8th of March. We know from the manuscripts that that's not a lot of people for decades thought that was exactly true, and that's what professors were telling their students. But we know now from the manuscripts it's not the case. The earliest, there's some poems dated the 4th of March. There's no poem dated the 8th of March, but we know that there was many poems of Caeiro written in the space of 2 weeks. And maybe the name Caeiro didn't come to him immediately, but the voice did. And it's also clear that it was like a revelation to him. He himself didn't really comprehend how this Caeiro came about. I should say that Caeiro and Campos, clearly there's a strong influence of Walt Whitman. So had read earlier, but I think it was only 1914 of the importance of Whitman, that Song of Myself and Being Everything and Multitudes, that Pessoa suddenly got it and then applied that to his own poetry.
Yeah, I would also just say, on the question of like Pessoan sincerity, I don't think he himself always fully knew. You didn't mention the letters to Ophelia,
All right.
his sort of only girlfriend, and those are actually I mean, maybe you want to talk about it, but one of his heteronyms sabotaged that love relationship.
Alfred de Camões.
Yeah, so it's kind of unclear where he stood, and they were certainly useful to him, to yeah, not treat it as a gimmick, as well.
Yeah. More? Okay, enough? No?
Thank you so much. Thank you all for attending this wonderful reading. We have some books for sale. The translators will be signing books. We just ask you please move your chairs up against one of the walls. Thanks so much.